Hello. I am here with Trish Sparks, the CEO of Clever, one of the top edtech companies in the world. I think it's fair to say that. Y'all started in the US, but are increasingly a global entity. So we can get into some of that maybe a little bit later. I've known about you guys for a long time. I think you have one of the coolest both edtech growth stories that there is and also the best access to the goings-ons of the ecosystems and the way that you interact with both schools and companies. So I'm excited to dig in with you on that. But before we go there, I'd love to hear sort of how you think about your career at Clever and everywhere else, and sort of the narrative arc that shaped where you got to today. So I'd love to just sort of give you the floor to talk about that.
Sure. Thanks for that. Um, I interviewed at Clever about 6 years ago. And at the time, it was for the VP of Customer Success role. And during that interview with the co founder and CEO at the time, he asked me the question about where I wanted to go with my career, like what were my career ambitions. And my answer shocked him a little bit, I think. It was that I eventually want to go back to the classroom. I started
I
my
love that.
career as a teacher. I thought I would retire as a teacher. I'd never wanted to do anything else. And I want to go back someday. And so I think that's surprised him. He was expecting to hear like, I want your job or something like that, but that was not the case. And so it really has been an interesting journey, starting out as a teacher, but then moving into enterprise software. I've done everything from tech support to pre-sales technical engineering to sales to customer success, people leadership, dabbed in a little bit of everything. I worked at LinkedIn for several years and ran a global organization there. But I really found my home with EdTech when I came to Clever. It's very surprising that it took me this long to get here because EdTech just seems like the right thing. You know, I love technology, I love education, I'm passionate about serving customers. And so, yeah, this is all the things I've been looking for all in one role.
That's awesome. I would love to share that career aspiration. I think, my parents were teachers, and so I similarly, would love to find a place in my career where teaching can at least be part of the story. And yeah, I think as a sort of end of career act, that would be a lot of fun to get into the classroom. So I'm envious that you had already sort of come to that conclusion 6 years ago.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, the state of the union right now for teachers is that it's really hard to be a teacher,
Yeah.
and with teacher pay and working conditions, it's really, really tough. And so, making sure that you can finance yourself and your life without having to depend on public teacher pay, it's a real challenge that a lot of teachers are going through.
Yeah, and we could spend a whole hour on some of the interesting things that states and districts are doing to change that equation and make it at least a little more accessible to be a teacher over a long-term career. I think we'll table that for a future discussion.
That's right. That could
Um,
be a whole hour.
totally. What I did want to ask about though, because I saw this as I was sort of doing my LinkedIn research, is you spent quite a bit of time in service roles and customer service roles specifically. And I think that's really interesting given all the, hubbub or hullabaloo around AI, right? And I think to me, and it's easy for me to write this narrative, like as more AI gets adopted, that service mentality becomes even more important for company leaders, sales leaders, et cetera. So I would love if you have any either anecdotes that you might want to share or through lines that you draw between leading service organizations and leading a big time enterprise SaaS edtech company like Clever. It's something I've been sort of scratching at the surface of, but haven't been able to articulate very well.
Yeah, so I think I agree with a lot of folks in that AI has so much opportunity to make things better. And at the same time, it can be scary for folks. It's the unknown. And so, in the world of EdTech and EdTech companies, I think we have an incredible opportunity to leverage it to make our products better and smarter and more effective and drive outcomes. And at the same time, in talking to our schools and the stakeholders in schools, there's a lot of hesitancy around AI for a couple of reasons. One is data privacy. And so, from a Clever perspective, we've been taking a very conservative approach as it relates to adopting AI and making sure, as you mentioned before, we house a lot of data and a lot of PII. And so, we don't take that lightly, our responsibility of keeping data secure and our privacy commitments to our schools and to our ed tech partners. And so that's something that we've been thinking a lot about. Some of the opportunities around, using AI and analytics and using AI to, even in the classroom, to remove some of the day-to-day administrative stuff that teachers are having to do. I mean, having been a former teacher, I remember the hours and hours of grading and taking attendance and like all of the things that are administrative that actually take time away from teaching and being with the students. And so I do think we have a huge opportunity in our companies and in our schools to leverage AI as long as we do it really thoughtfully and conservatively in some cases. We actually had our customer advisory board a couple of months ago where we had some district leaders that met with some of the executives from some of the biggest ed tech vendors in the country. And the conversation was fascinating as it relates to AI. And one of the things that we noticed was just how schools are excited about what it can bring, but they really want the ed tech vendors to have a ton of communication and transparency around how AI is being used in those products. One of the panel members, a CIO from a school here in North Carolina, mentioned that it felt sometimes like a sneak attack, like some of our ed tech products are sneaking in AI and not telling anybody. And as an executive in a school district, wanting to know how data is being used and if there is a third party AI vendor that's taking in some of the data, that's something that we really need to make sure that we help our ed tech partners communicate and provide as much transparency as possible so that the schools feel confident in how the data is being used and what it's being used for.
That's helpful. I think it is sort of interesting as I thought about this year's ASU GSV conference compared to last year's, right? And last year it felt a lot like, sort of neat side projects were being highlighted. And this year it felt like the product features were a lot more intentionally designed. At the very least from the bigger companies that I think have the same customer responsibility that you're talking about of we can't just, sort of throw stuff out there. We have to think about not only what is good for the users, but what are our users ready to use. And it's a really tricky balance that's just as much sort of service work and talking with them about it as it is building the technology, right? So I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper too on the like state of play in K-12 schools. And it sounds like a lot of the feedback you're getting is sort of anxiety, for lack of a better word to put it. And I'm sure there are optimists too, but I'd love just from your sort of like eagle eye position working with, I'm sure you could, most US K-12 school districts. What are some of the things that you're seeing maybe changing this year, 2025, compared to last?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier about Clever's unique position in the EdTech ecosystem and having connections with thousands and thousands of schools, as well as lots of application partners and being able to see both sides of it. And both sides are encountering challenges right now, for sure, and a lot of headwinds. And being in a service role, like you mentioned me being in service roles for so many years, I still consider myself in a service role as it relates to serving the people, our employees at Clever, but also our customers. And one of the things that we hear so much from schools consistently is the challenges with teacher shortages and with funding. So teacher shortages are for lots of reasons: decrease in funding, decrease in enrollment, working conditions, teacher pay, like all of that has led to a ton of teacher shortages and classrooms without teachers. I have 2 kids and they both have encountered long periods of time with substitutes in their classroom that are not certified to teach. And that is the case all over the US. And then we all know about the ESSER funds, ending last year and the impact that that has had. And then the ripple effects of that are on a lot of ed tech vendors in the ecosystem. There was a reality of like during the pandemic, budgets were flowing and allowing schools to buy whatever ed tech products they needed to be able to serve students at home for a long period of time. And so some schools ended up with 10 math apps. And what we're seeing is schools, now that they're facing a lot of budget constraints, they're going in and trying to determine which the EdTech solutions are providing the most impactful outcomes. And they are consolidating. And what used to be maybe they had 10 apps doing the same similar things, now they need 3. One for elementary, one for middle school, one for high school, but then eliminating the rest. And so we're seeing that ripple effect with a lot of EdTech vendors that are struggling with the renewals than they were 3 or 4 years ago, soon after the pandemic. So some of those ripple effects that are caused on one side of the ecosystem are definitely being felt by the other side as well.
And can you talk at all about sort of how Clever's role in that sort of rebasing of the ecosystem? Like, what are some of the things that y'all are focused on, you know, this year? What are some of the initiatives you're taking? I imagine that try to help both sides of that equation, because I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it's in your interest for both sides to flourish. So, like, how do you mediate that change?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I would even go so far as to say when Clever is at our best self, when we're at our best self, we are that glue between the schools and the EdTech vendors. When an enterprise EdTech vendor wants to roll out in one of the largest school districts in the country, they come to us to help them with that because that's a really difficult thing to do. And
Yeah.
so that is when we definitely are our best selves, but we do have specific initiatives that we're working on this year to help solve some of the problems that are out there. So I mentioned, 6 years ago when I came to Clever interviewing with the CEO, and during the interview, one of the questions I asked him was, why are you just in the US? Like, isn't this a universal problem that you have? Like, why are we just solving rostering and SSO in the US? And his answer was brilliant and simple and just like focus. We're going to focus on the US market. We're going to do it better than anybody else. We want to help as many schools and teachers and students in the US first. And then once we nail that, then we'll lift our heads up and we will build more solutions for more of our customer base and we will expand globally. And so every year we would ask ourselves, is this the year? Is this the year that we're going to expand globally or that we're going to build more solutions for more audiences? And a couple of years ago, around the time that we crossed around 75% of the market shares, Clever's in about 75% of US K-12 schools. We said, okay, now it's time. It's time for us to start thinking about other things, other markets outside the US, and building additional solutions for some of our stakeholders. And so the last couple of years, we have been focused on expanding globally, focused on strategic markets like the UK, Ireland, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. But then just recently, we've had a ton of traction in Brazil. I was just at Brazil a couple of weeks ago at Bet Brazil.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
we have seen much more traction there than I even anticipated. So that also is really exciting. And then for years, we've been hearing from our schools that there were cybersecurity needs that were not being met from the existing enterprise partners that provide cybersecurity solutions to enterprise companies. A lot of enterprise companies just don't think about solving it for the classroom. So whether it's identity management or classroom multi-factor authentication is something that our schools need at a reasonable price that's built specifically for education. And so that's been some of the transition that Clever has gone through over the last few years, is really becoming that identity platform for education built specifically for schools. And so if you think about it, like classroom multi-factor authentication, there's not a lot of people that want to build MFA for kindergartners, but that's what we do. I mean, we
Yeah.
solve problems in the classroom. And so that's been some really exciting stuff that we've been working on over the last couple of years. And it's going really well because, it is our responsibility to secure all the digital identities. And some people think of digital identity, that sounds so technical, like what is that? And no, it's not. It's really just people in the school community ecosystem. So it's teachers, it's students, it's bus drivers, it's librarians, it's parents, everybody in the ecosystem needs to have a digital identity as it relates to their school. And so Clever helping to do that, whether it's provisioning accounts, deprovisioning, securing the identities, providing multi-factor authentication. That's something that we're really excited to help fill that gap for both our application partners as it relates to them needing to serve their customers in this way and provide, very safe and secure solutions, but also the schools that are in need of it. Because one of the things that we hear from our schools is that cybersecurity insurance companies are requiring multi-factor authentication now, even to get your insurance policy. And for a while, it was just staff that they were requiring that for, or teachers. But more and more, we're hearing that they're requiring it for students as well. And so that is a problem we're trying to help them solve. And in the last year, it has grown significantly as a part of our business that we're able to serve our schools in that way.
The concept, I'm not going to call it a problem, but a concept has been top of mind for me, mostly for unrelated reasons this past couple of weeks. The first was, of course, the Real ID rollout, where now you need a Real ID to go to the
Yep.
airport. And it's sort of interesting. I was reading about that. And I promise this will circle back in that I think it's been like 20 years since the Real ID Act, and something like it's only like 30 or 40% of driver's licenses are Real ID compliant at this point. So it's like on one side of the spectrum, you have government mandated change, which resulted in a 30, maybe 40% uptake. And then on the other end of the spectrum, still early days. I was just reading about Airbnb's, dramatic reinvention, and I'll send you the article about this that came out in Wired just this week. And it was interesting. The Airbnb CEO, Brian Chesky, was talking about how he wants to be an identity platform in the context of not just, home stays and hotel stays, but also for the experiences that you have in life, right? Like the interactions that you have with your barber or the interactions you have at your gym or whatever. And that sort of dual-sided rating system for your adult identity. And obviously you guys are somewhere in the middle, right? You're dealing with public institutions, public school districts and public sector data. And you're also dealing with humans. And I imagine, again, I'm guessing, and you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong, that your sort of go-to-market strategy related to identity has to factor both, right? Like you need uptick, your parents and your students and like the actual people who use it. And you also need to make sure you're compliant on the sort of public sector side. So you can take that wherever you want, but I just think like identity is such a sort of omnipresent problem right now, and setting aside all the AI stuff. So I'd just love to hear sort of you riff on that concept.
Yeah, so I will validate what you believe to be true. That is
I love when that
absolutely
happens.
the case. And that's such a great example of the Real ID and how it's taken 20 years to get where we are, because it's all about change management and thinking through like how change is adopted over time. And identity is definitely one of those things. It used to be that a lot of companies would develop solutions that it was just ease of access was the most important thing. And now what we see is that it's ease of access, but also in a secure way. And
Right.
how do you do that? How do you provide security with identity without implementing a lot of friction for the user? And so same thing in the classroom, right? Like how do you get a kindergartner logged in 5 seconds, but in a secure way so that you're not spending all of your time working on that? And, I think about this similarly to the way that AI is being adopted as well, because if you remember, 8 or 9 years ago, tech was a new thing. And that was it was very scary for folks in the schools. And it was like, oh, is it going to replace our teachers? And there was all of
Right.
this concern around that. And there's been a ton of change management as it relates to the adoption of ed tech over the last 10 years, and especially during the pandemic. It was one of those top down kind of things, like you will adopt ed tech. And so that actually spurred it, just like this Real ID thing. Like all of a sudden there's a date and it has to move by that date. But I do see the same thing happening with AI. I mean, we have a Future of the Classroom report that we release every year. And a couple of years ago, the vast majority of stakeholders in the schools were very concerned about AI and thought it was going to make their jobs harder. And I would say in the last report, a couple of years later, that tide has shifted in that there's more folks in schools that see the opportunity of AI and they're open to it, and at the same time still being conservative. So I do see those changes actually having a shorter lifespan now, like they're happening faster, but not as fast as some people would want. What took us, 10 years to get to this place with the adoption of EdTech, AI is definitely moving a lot faster, but at the same time, still a lot of the same concerns around, is it going to, degrade the classroom experience? Is it going to replace the teacher? All of those things, those concerns are there, but they're starting to decrease. That's what we have started seeing in some of our surveys.
Yeah, I want to say a moment of appreciation for your longitudinal approach, because I think it's helpful to see that change over time rather than just the like single survey, like this is the conclusion.
Exactly.
I do want to let you get out of here, but maybe one last question before you go that hopefully is a fun one and relates to your sort of future of the schools surveys, which is like, what does the classroom of the future look like? Like, if we're going out, call it 3 to 5 years. So, we're not living in, Star Wars, cities, but 3 to 5 years in the future, I imagine there will be some changes and some things that look pretty similar. Do you have any thoughts on what the classroom experience might look like at that point?
Yes. So this is where I put my teacher hat on and I think about what the future of the classroom could look like and what it should look like and how Clever can help that. And I still have an optimistic view about it. I mean, it's easy to think about all the things that aren't going right, but I do think we're in the age of technology that we can solve some of these problems for teachers, the teacher shortages, the burnouts. Like, we can use technology to remove some of that friction and the administrative work that the teachers are doing and give them more time back in the classroom. AI is going to do a lot of great things, but our kids still need teachers. They need to walk into a classroom. They need to have people that they see every day, that they know care about them and that are going to help them in their learning journey. And AI can't do that, but it can be leveraged to make a teacher's life better. And so I would love to see the future of the classroom with every classroom having a teacher in it, which is not the case right now. And then also just having personalized learning experiences for students, that hasn't always been possible. I know being in a classroom with 30 students and you have students of all varieties of learning capabilities, different experiences, strengths, and areas for development, and like trying to teach a classroom of 30 folks, it's really hard to provide a really personalized learning experience. But I do think technology is going to help us do that as well, so that students get what they need in the classroom when they need it, real time, versus, trying to shoot for the middle and, one thing trying to
Leaving
serve
out both ends.
all
Yeah,
30 students the same way. So personalized learning and improving working conditions for teachers. I think that's the future of the classroom.
I like that. I like that. And importantly, like the classroom has a teacher and it also has a really individualized path for each student. I think that's a noble aspiration.
That's ideal state. Well, that's what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you, Trish. I appreciate you taking the time and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yes, thanks so much. I appreciate your time.